London always feels like a city haunted by its past. The fog rolls in, smothering the streets, and you can almost hear the whispers of those who died under gaslights or vanished in its labyrinthine alleys. It was into this thick fog that I, Elric Graves, was summoned, trailing the scent of blood and death. The letter had been unsigned, slipped under my door at the Earl's Court Inn. The Hook Man strikes again. 25 dead. London Bridge. You're needed. At dawn, I stood beneath the bridge's towering arches, the Thames flowing sluggishly beneath me. The air smelled of iron and damp stone. The victims, 15 men and 10 women, were splayed across the cobblestones, their bodies pale and twisted. Each throat had been slashed, their faces frozen in terror. But the most horrifying detail was the precision. Every cut was the same, as if made by the same hand. Nearby, Detective Inspector Arthur Bell stared at me skeptically. "You're the occult investigator." "That's one name for it," I said. "Tell me everything." The city morgue was colder than the fog outside, its brick walls lined with rows of steel tables. I examined the bodies, my gloved fingers tracing the deep gouges on their necks. The wounds were peculiar, not jagged like a knife's edge, but smooth and curved, as though a hook had done the deed. A faint, acrid smell lingered around the victims, one I couldn't place. Bell stood beside me, his jaw tight. No witnesses. No sounds. The guards on the bridge saw nothing until they stumbled on the bodies. "Nothing human could do this so cleanly," I murmured. Bell frowned. "You think it's not human?" "I think you called me because you suspect it isn't," I replied. That evening, Bell introduced me to the first and only person who had come forward, a homeless man named Gideon who claimed to have seen the killer. He was jittery, his face gaunt and his hands trembling. "It wasn't a man," Gideon whispered. "It moved too fast. Tall, black coat, hat low over its face, and that hook. It gleamed in the fog." "What else did you see?" I asked. Gideon hesitated, his eyes darting to the shadows. "It didn't walk. It glided. Like it wasn't touching the ground." Bell scoffed, but I leaned closer. "Where did it go?" Gideon pointed toward the south end of the bridge. "It disappeared into the fog, like it was swallowed whole." The hook was more than a weapon, it was a message. Each crime scene held another clue. On the wall near the victims, carved into the stone, was a single symbol, a crescent moon bisected by a jagged line. "I've seen this before," I told Bell. "In the Black Archives of Prague. It's a sigil tied to the Harbinger, a mythical figure said to reap the souls of the damned." Bell stared at me, incredulous. "You're saying a myth is running around London with a hook?" "I'm saying myths often have roots in reality. Something has awakened this thing." By the third night, the city was gripped by fear. News of the murders spread, and people abandoned the streets after sundown. I spent my nights walking London's alleys, listening for the telltale scrape of a hook against cobblestones. It came sooner than I expected. A high-pitched scream cut through the silence, and I ran toward the sound. In a dimly lit alley, I found her, a young woman sprawled against the wall, blood pooling at her feet. I scanned the shadows, my revolver loaded with silver rounds. "Show yourself." A figure emerged, tall and imposing, clad in a dark coat and top hat. The gleaming hook glinted in the faint light, its curved edge dripping with blood. The figure moved with supernatural speed, vanishing into the fog before I could fire. But it left behind a chilling message. Scratched into the brick wall above the victim's body were 3 words, "The end nears." I returned to the morgue with the new victim. As I examined her, I noticed something I'd missed before, a faint, dark residue around the wounds. I scraped a sample and placed it in a vial. "What is it?" Bell asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "But I suspect it's not of this world." The residue's analysis revealed nothing earthly, its composition was untraceable, as though it didn't belong in our reality. It reacted violently to salt and iron, sparking faintly when the elements touched it. Belle and I returned to the bridge, where we discovered another clue, a hidden passage beneath the southern arch. Inside, we found a crude altar adorned with symbols identical to those carved at the crime scenes. Candles burned low, their wax dripping onto a pile of decayed bones. "Someone summoned it," I said, my voice heavy. "This isn't random, it's deliberate." The altar wasn't just a place of worship, it was a gateway. Etched into the stone floor was a summoning circle, its intricate lines glowing faintly under my UV lamp. Symbols like those I'd seen before adorned its edges, but one stood out, a jagged crescent surrounded by spidery runes. "It's recent," I muttered, examining the wax drippings and fresh scorch marks. "Someone used this to call the harbinger." Bell crossed his arms, his skepticism wavering. "Who would summon a killer like this? And why? Power? Revenge? Or maybe something darker?" I stood, brushing the dust from my coat. Whatever the reason, this summoner might be controlling the Hook Man, or feeding it victims to keep it satisfied. We questioned the few locals who dared speak to us. A pattern began to emerge: strange noises at night, whispers of secret meetings, and sightings of a shadowy figure in a long coat frequenting an abandoned warehouse by the docks. Gideon, our first witness, was one of the few who'd seen the summoning circle before. "It's old magic," he said, his eyes darting nervously. "Older than London itself. The kind of thing you don't mess with unless you're desperate, or mad." That night, Belle and I staked out the warehouse. The fog rolled in thick, swallowing the moonlight. Hours passed in tense silence until a figure emerged, clutching a lantern and a leather-bound book. "Got you," Belle muttered, stepping forward. The man froze as Belle's revolver clicked, but his expression was calm, almost smug. "You're too late," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Under the lantern light, his features came into focus: hollow cheeks, wild eyes, and a deep scar running down the side of his face. Around his neck hung a pendant bearing the crescent sigil. "Who are you?" Belle demanded. "I'm the one who opened the gate," the man replied, his tone eerily serene. "And the one who cannot close it." As I stepped closer, I noticed his hands trembling, his fingers stained with dried blood. "Why summon it?" I asked. "Because it's necessary," he hissed. "The harbinger isn't here for me, it's here for all of us." Before we could press further, a piercing screech echoed from the fog. The man grinned. "It's coming." The screech grew louder, and the fog thickened, swirling unnaturally around us. A metallic scraping sound followed, like a blade dragged across stone. Bell cursed under his breath, gripping his revolver. I grabbed the summoner by the collar. "What did you do?" "I didn't summon it," he stammered. "Not really. I only opened the door." Before I could press him further, the Hook Man emerged from the mist, its towering form more monstrous than before. The hook gleamed in the dim light, its edge dripping with what could only be blood. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted toward the docks, the Hook Man gliding after us with impossible speed. The summoner stumbled, his screams cut short as the creature descended upon him. Bell and I barely escaped, the creature's guttural growl echoing behind us. Safe in Bell's office, we examined the leather-bound book recovered from the summoner. Its pages were filled with archaic symbols and rituals, some written in languages I barely recognized. But one passage stood out, a warning written in jagged, frantic handwriting. "The harbinger serves no master. It feeds on fear and death, growing stronger with every soul it claims." "It's not just killing," I said, my voice grim. "It's growing. Each death makes it harder to stop." Bell looked pale. "Then what's the plan?" "We find out who's left the door open, and slam it shut." The book's final pages mentioned an ancient order called the Ebon Crescent, a secret society rumored to have existed for centuries. Their goal, to summon and bind supernatural entities to their will. Bell tracked down a historian who specialized in London's occult history, an eccentric named Edward Thorne. In his cluttered library, Thorne confirmed the society's existence. They believed the Harbinger was a divine punishment, a tool to cleanse the unworthy. But their last attempt to control it ended in disaster. The survivors scattered, their secrets buried, until now. Thorne's research led us to an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of London, once owned by a prominent member of the Ebon Crescent. The decayed estate was overgrown with ivy, its windows shattered and its halls silent. Inside, we found remnants of the society's rituals, symbols carved into the walls, blackened candles, and a shattered mirror framed in silver. But the most disturbing discovery was a journal detailing their final summoning attempt. We thought we could control it, the journal read. We were fools. The Harbinger answers only to death. As the Hook man's body count rose, London descended into chaos. The police implemented a curfew, but fear drove people to desperation. Reports of false sightings flooded Bell's office, each more outlandish than the last. Meanwhile, I pored over the Summoner's book, searching for a way to banish the Harbinger. One passage offered a glimmer of hope, a ritual to sever its connection to this world. But it required something I didn't have, the Summoner's blood. The Summoner's dead, Bell said grimly. How do we get his blood now? I have an idea, I replied, though it was one I hoped I'd never have to use. The Summoner's death was a setback, but the ritual's notes mentioned a loophole, any direct blood relative could serve as a substitute. Bell and I scoured the Summoner's background, piecing together fragments of his identity. His name was Desmond Price, a disgraced academic who had vanished years earlier after dabbling in the occult. A search through old records revealed a sister, Eleanor Price, living in Whitechapel. When we found her, she was hesitant to speak, her eyes shadowed with grief. Desmond's obsession killed him, didn't it? She asked quietly. It did, I admitted. But if we don't act, it will kill countless more. Eleanor hesitated before nodding. What do you need me to do? The ritual demanded precision. The Summoner's bloodline was only the first piece. We needed an anchor, a physical object tied to the Harbinger. That meant returning to its nesting site beneath London Bridge to retrieve the hook itself. Bell was reluctant. You've seen what that thing can do. You really want to get close enough to take its weapon? We don't have a choice, I replied. That night, armed with salt rounds, iron stakes, and Eleanor's reluctant blessing, we descended into the shadowy depths of the bridge. The fog was thicker than ever, the air heavy with the scent of decay. The Hook man's lair was unchanged, symbols glowed faintly on the walls, and the pile of bones seemed to have grown. Bell and I crept forward, every step echoing in the stillness. The Hook lay embedded in a blood-stained altar, its metal gleaming even in the dim light. As I reached for it, a low growl rumbled through the air. The Hook man emerged, its towering frame more monstrous than ever. The fog seemed to cling to it, swirling around its hunched shoulders. Get the hook! I shouted to Bell, drawing my revolver. The Hook man moved with inhuman speed, its blade slicing through the air with deadly precision. Bell and I fought like men possessed, salt rounds tearing through the fog but barely slowing the creature. I hurled a warding charm, the runes etched into it glowing briefly before shattering against the creature's chest. It recoiled, giving Bell enough time to seize the hook. Run! I bellowed, covering our retreat with a final shot. The Hook man shrieked, its cry reverberating through the tunnels as we fled. The hook pulsed with a sinister energy, its surface icy to the touch. Back at Bell's office, I worked through the night, preparing the ritual circle with Eleanor's blood and a series of protective wards. The hook is its tether, I explained. By severing its connection, we can force it back to where it came from. But what if it resists? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. It will, I admitted. And that's why we need to be ready. Word spread that the Hook Man had been wounded. It retaliated with fury, claiming 5 more lives in a single night. The city's fear reached a fever pitch, and Bell's men were stretched thin, chasing false leads as panic consumed the streets. Meanwhile, I finalized the ritual's details. The location had to be precise, where the summoning first occurred. That meant returning to the summoning circle beneath the bridge, a move that filled Bell with dread. "It's suicide," he said. "It's necessary," I countered. "The Harbinger won't stop until we make it." Under the cover of darkness, we descended into the lair for the last time. Eleanor stood in the center of the ritual circle, her hands trembling as she clutched a vial of her own blood. Bell and I formed a protective barrier around her, armed with every weapon and charm at our disposal. The air grew colder, the fog thickening unnaturally. A metallic scrape announced the Hook Man's arrival. It emerged from the shadows, its hollow eyes locked on Eleanor. "Keep it off her," I shouted as Bell opened fire. Eleanor recited the incantation, her voice shaky but determined. The hook trembled in my hands, its dark energy radiating outward. The symbols on the walls began to glow, the circle pulsing with power. The Hook Man lunged, its blade slicing through the air. Bell tackled it mid-swing, his rifle clattering to the ground. I plunged an iron stake into its side, the creature howling in pain as the ritual's power intensified. "Hurry!" I yelled to Eleanor. The circle erupted in light, a blinding glow that forced the creature back. It thrashed and shrieked, its form distorting as the tether between it and the hook snapped. The energy surged, threatening to tear the room apart. Eleanor's voice reached a crescendo, the final words of the incantation echoing through the lair. The Hook Man collapsed, its body disintegrating into a cloud of ash. The lair fell silent, the oppressive fog lifting as the ritual ended. "It's over," Eleanor whispered, collapsing to her knees. London awoke to a city freed from terror, but the scars remained. The newspapers declared the murder solved, though the official explanation was as mundane as possible, a madman on the loose. Bell and I knew better. The Harbinger was gone, but the forces that had summoned it were not. Somewhere in London, remnants of the Ebon Crescent waited, their ambitions undeterred. As I packed my bags to leave the city, Bell stopped me. "You think this is the last we'll see of them?" I shook my head. The Hook Man was just one chapter in their story. There will be others. And with that, I disappeared into the London fog, ready for whatever came next. Desmond Price had always been drawn to the forbidden. As a historian at King's College London, his early career focused on occult symbology, a niche field that earned him equal parts admiration and derision. But something shifted after he discovered an old journal hidden in the university archives, a battered leather volume detailing the rituals of the Ebon Crescent. The journal hinted at a power unimaginable, a harbinger of death, summoned to cleanse or destroy. At first, Desmond dismissed it as myth, a cautionary tale cloaked in mysticism. But as he dug deeper, he found references in texts from Prague, Cairo, and even colonial Salem. The accounts were eerily consistent, all describing a shadowy figure with a hooked weapon. One entry stood out: the Harbinger answers not to mortal will but to blood and sacrifice. Those who summon it must bear its price. Desmond's curiosity turned to obsession. He traveled to Prague, where he gained access to a hidden wing of the Strahov Monastery library. There, he uncovered a complete summoning ritual, scrawled in ancient ink on brittle parchment. The ritual required a summoning circle, a specific lunar alignment, and the offering of blood. But Desmond didn't stop at study. He sought out remnants of the Ebon Crescent, contacting shadowy figures who whispered of ancient power. One such figure, a man named Kovacs, claimed to possess the Harbinger's hook, retrieved decades ago from an abandoned ritual site. Desmond paid a small fortune to acquire it, the metal cold and heavy in his hands. The hook practically hummed with dark energy. Back in London, Desmond prepared the ritual beneath London Bridge, choosing the site for its convergence of ley lines and the Thames' ancient waters. But his desperation blinded him to the warnings etched into the summoning text: the harbinger cannot be controlled. It is both blade and executioner. The night of the summoning was one of the darkest London had seen in decades. Beneath the bridge, Desmond arranged candles and carved the sigils into the damp stone. The hook lay at the circle's center, a focal point for the ritual's energy. He pricked his finger with a ceremonial blade, letting his blood drip onto the runes. As the final incantation left his lips, the air grew heavy, the temperature plummeting. The fog thickened unnaturally, curling like living tendrils around him. Then came the sound, a low, metallic scraping that sent a chill down his spine. The hook man emerged from the shadows, its towering frame barely human. Its hollow eyes burned with malevolence, and its weapon gleamed as though it thirsted for blood. For a moment, Desmond was awestruck. He had summoned a legend, a being of pure death. But awe turned to terror as the creature turned toward him, its hooked blade raised. Desmond barely escaped with his life. In a panic, he threw himself to the ground, clutching the hook. The creature hesitated, its movements slowing as if recognizing its tether to the summoner. Desmond seized the moment, invoking an ancient binding spell he'd memorized from the journal. The hook man froze, its head cocked unnaturally as though listening. Desmond realized the spell hadn't enslaved the creature, it had only stayed its blade. "I can offer you more," Desmond stammered. "Souls. Blood. Whatever you want. Just don't take mine." The creature let out a guttural hiss that Desmond took as agreement. From that moment, he became its harbinger in turn, luring victims to the bridge under the guise of research and feeding their lives to the hook man. Each sacrifice strengthened the bond, granting Desmond a measure of protection. But the journal had been right, the harbinger served no master. The more Desmond fed the creature, the more his grip on reality unraveled. The hook became an extension of his being, its presence warping his mind and body. He began to hear whispers in the night, guttural voices that urged him to kill, to bring more blood to the circle. But the hook man's appetite was insatiable, and Desmond couldn't keep up. The murders escalated, spiraling beyond his control. The creature began taking victims on its own, and Desmond could only watch in terror as it grew stronger, its form more monstrous with each kill. Desmond's final journal entry read, "The harbinger cannot be controlled. It will turn on me soon. My only hope is to find another, a way to pass the tether to someone else." If you're reading this, it may already be too late. When Belle and I found Desmond, he was a broken man, his pact with the hook man shattered. His death was inevitable, the price of summoning a force far beyond his understanding. But his final words lingered in my mind: "The harbinger cannot be killed. Only bound. And always, at a cost." As I finished scrawling the last verse, Belle entered my room at the Earl's Court Inn, looking uneasy. "You hear it too, don't you?" he asked. I nodded, sliding the paper into my coat pocket. "It's a warning. Or a promise. The hook man might be gone for now, but something tells me London hasn't seen the last of him." Belle exhaled heavily, the lines of his face deepening. "And if he comes back?" I adjusted my hat and shouldered my bag. "Then you know where to find me." And with that, I disappeared into the London fog, the haunting melody of the hook man echoing softly in my mind.